morning. So I will be discussing to you a shortcut or a simpler explanation of how we do your ABG analysis. Take note, your ABG is composed of the following. We have your pH, we have your partial pressure of your oxygen or your PaCO2. We also have here your bicarbonate. And lastly, we also have here your partial pressure of your oxygen. So let's start first with your pH. Take note that in the case of your pH, this will now determine whether the blood is acidic or basic. Basic would either mean alkalotic. So the pH will ultimately determine kung merong acidosis or alkalosis ang pasyente natin. Next, we also have here, before that, what is the normal range of your pH? The normal range of your pH is 7.35 to 7.45. Please take note that more than, if we go beyond your pH, that is already alkalosis. If it is under or less than your normal range, that is acidosis. Just take note that in the case of your pH, it is like a buffer. Ibig sabihin, kinokontra niya yung hydrogen ions ng katawan. So, when there is higher pH, then it will have alkalosis. It will become more basic. Kung lesser ang pH, konti na yung nagkokontra sa hydrogen ions, which is hydrogen ions is directly related to acid. Kaya, nagkakaroon ng acidosis. Now, let's go to your partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Your PaCO2, on the other hand, will determine your carbon dioxide levels. Carbon dioxide levels in the body. A very important thing to also note is that carbon dioxide is regulated by your lungs. Yung lungs ang nagko-control niyan. The normal range of your partial pressure of your carbon dioxide is 35 to 45. It is easy to understand kasi ang pH 7.35 to 7.45. PaCO2 is from here and there 35 to 45. Please memorize these values, okay? So 35 to 45. Take note so that we will know kung alkalotic siya or alkalosis or acidosis. Carbon dioxide, usually, the higher levels of your carbon dioxide would also be directly related with the increased amount of your hydrogen ions. And take note, since hydrogen ions are related with your acid, nagkakaroon ng acidosis. So the more carbon dioxide in the body, the more acid. So, the higher kung abnormal value yan, it is more than 45, that is acidosis. Dito naman, pag less than yung value ng carbon dioxide, that is alkalosis. Yan. Circle natin yan. Encircle, circle, encircle. Normal levels ng pH, normal levels ng PaCO2. Now, let's go to your bicarbonate. Your bicarbonate, on the other hand, is now your bicarbonate. Your bicarbonate is regulated by the kidneys. So, siyang nagko-control niyan. Your kidneys, before that, in your PaCO2, we mentioned that it is controlled by the lungs. So, ibig sabihin, any abnormalities in the PaCO2, we will attribute it to respiratory. Kasi lungs ang affected. HCO3 naman, again, we relate that with your metabolic. Yan. So, your kidneys will now regulate the amount of bicarbonate. The bicarbonate acts as a buffer to your hydrogen ions. So, ibig sabihin, the more bicarbonate we have, ibig sabihin, the more basic or the more alkalotic it is. What is the normal range of your bicarbonate? The normal range of your bicarbonate is 22 to 26 mex or milliequivalents per liter. This one is millimeter mercury. Ayan. In your this means that the higher bicarbonate levels, then it is more alkalotic, or it can lead to alkalosis. If there is lesser bicarbonate levels naman, kung abnormal siya and it is less than 22, that is already acidosis. So, we will try again to yan, normal levels. Pag it is more than 26, that is alkalosis. If it is less than 22, that is acidosis. So, take note, usually, ang magkapareho dyan is your bicarbonate and your pH. If they are higher, it is more alkalosis. If they are lower, it is more acidosis. Yung PaCO2 naman, baliktad yan. The more carbon dioxide in the body, the more acidic it is. The lesser the carbon dioxide in the body, the more alkalotic it is. Your partial pressure of your oxygen naman is not really directly related with the determination of whether the patient has respiratory or metabolic acidosis. So it would simply determine if the patient is hypoxemic. So again, this is also controlled by your lungs. The normal level of your partial pressure of your oxygen is 80 to 100 millimeter mercury. However, you will also note that some books would say it is 75 to 100, some books would say 85 to 100. So for purposes of your computation and your activity, that is 80 to 100. So if it is less than 80 millimeter mercury, the patient may be hypoxemic. Take note, this is different from the O2 sat sa ating O2 sat sa ating pulse oximeter. It is still different, okay? Kasi ang normal natin dyan ay 95 to 100%. Okay. Let's proceed with let's have the different steps of determining your ABG analysis. So there are 3 steps. First step is to first determine whether it is acidosis or alkalosis. How are we going to do that? We do that by checking the pH. So pH ang importante sa step 1 natin. So ang titignan lang muna natin is the amount or the value of your pH. Na-mention natin that in your pH, the normal value is again 7.35 to 7.45. So please memorize these ones. And then, of course, if it is less than 7.35, that is acidosis. If it is more than 7.45, that is alkalosis. So this is the normal range. Ayan. Let's try to give you an example. If the pH value of the patient is 7.30, you know that 7.30 is less than your 7.35 to 7.45, which is the normal value. So, acidosis yan. If it is more than 7.45, in this case, we have 7.50. That is already, since that is more than 7.45, that is already alkalosis. So that is for step 1 of your ABG analysis. For your step 2 naman, once you determine the pH value of step 1, now let's determine your whether the value is respiratory or metabolic. So how will we know if it is respiratory or metabolic? We will now look into the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. And we also have here the bicarbonate levels. So for your partial pressure of your carbon dioxide, take note, it is directly related with your acid. Why? Bakit directly related? The more carbon dioxide in the body, the more acidic it is. Yung bicarbonate naman, it is more related with your base or yung alkalinity. So, the higher your bicarbonate levels in the body, the more basic or alkalotic it is. We also mentioned that in the case of your PaCO2, it is controlled by your lungs. So, respiratory. Yung bicarbonate naman is related with your kidneys and it is metabolic. Ayan. So, how will we now know kung respiratory yan or metabolic? Take note that if one is normal and the other is abnormal, most likely, yung abnormal na yan, yun yung magiging condition ng pasyente natin. So, for example, in this case, yung metabolic ang abnormal, normal ang respiratory. So, the case now is metabolic. Kung ang abnormal level naman is respiratory, then, tas yung metabolic is normal, then the case is respiratory. So, that is how you're going to determine that. So, let's try to give you an example so that you will be able to understand it more further. So, example number 1, the pH is 7.27, PaCO2 is 50, HCO3 is 25. So, in your pH, we mentioned that 7.35 to 7.45 is the normal level. So, it is less than. This is already less than the normal level. We mentioned that less than pH, that is already acidosis. So, acidic yan. Next, let's check here kung saan dito ang abnormal. So, PaCO2, normal level natin is, kunin mo lang dito sa taas, 35 dapat yan. 35 to 45 ang normal levels. So, in this case, 50 is greater than the normal level of 45. So, ito yung abnormal. So, this is already a respiratory. Since mataas yan, so ibig sabihin, pag mataas ang carbon dioxide natin, that is acidosis. So, respiratory acidosis. Bicarbonate, is that normal? Because ang range natin is 22 to 26, so it is normal. So, most likely, ang case natin is, yan, di ba, acidic. So, tama yan, magkapareho yan. So, it is respiratory acidosis. Now, let's go to example number 2. In your example number 2, your pH level is 7.6. That is also beyond the normal of 7.45. So, since more than yan, we know that that is already alkalosis. PaCO2 naman, normal level, 35 to 45. So, pag konti ang PaCO2 natin, we know that that is alkalosis. This is respiratory alkalosis. Kasi, carbon dioxide is respiratory. HCO3 naman is 22 to 26. That is normal. So, in this case, you know that this is respiratory alkalosis. Now, let's go to step 3. Nasabi natin in your step 1, determine the pH muna, whether it is acidosis or alkalosis. Step 2, determine whether the problem is respiratory or metabolic. Ibig sabihin, saan nag-uugat yung problema? Sa lungs ba or respiratory ba ang problema? Or sa metabolic? Either in the kidneys or, for example, sa digestive system natin. Ayan. Now, let's go to step 3. The last one is to determine the type of compensation in your step 3. What does it mean naman? Na-mention natin that in your step 3, we determine compensation. So, what do you mean by compensation? So, if there is an abnormality in your body, if there is a problem with either your metabolic or your respiratory, sa carbon dioxide or bicarbonate, your body will try to compensate by increasing one aspect or one ABG in the body in order to neutralize or at least mag-normalize in an attempt to normalize the level of pH in the body. So, that is what you mean by compensation. So, for example, di ba? Pag hindi nagiging maganda yung quiz mo, for example, on one subject, nagko-compensate ka by bumabawi ka dun sa next na quizzes mo. So, that is what you meant by compensation. It's like you're trying to change an aspect para mag-normalize or ma-equalize natin yung situation. So that is what you meant by compensation. So take note, in your respiratory acidosis or in your respiratory alkalosis, kung ang problema natin is respiratory, ibig sabihin problem with the carbon dioxide. Kung respiratory acidosis or alkalosis yan, ang magko-compensate dyan is yung bicarbonate. Yung katawan, it's either i-increase niya yung bicarbonate niya or i-decrease niya yung bicarbonate niya. So in this case, if there is respiratory acidosis or too much carbon dioxide in the body, what will happen? Your body will compensate by increasing the amount of bicarbonate. Diba nasabi natin, it is a buffer para kontrahin niya yung too much acid in the body. Kaya, usually, ang normal levels, o hindi normal levels, ang usually nangyayari dyan, more than the normal level, yung amount of bicarbonate na nire-release ng katawan. Kung respiratory alkalosis naman, meaning konti ang carbon dioxide, abnormally low ang carbon dioxide, your body will compensate by decreasing the amount of your bicarbonate. So, if you're going to reflect that in the ABG, usually that is less than 22 megs per liter. That is also the same with your metabolic problem. Kung ang problema natin is rooted to your metabolic, ibig sabihin bicarbonate levels ang problema natin dyan, your body will compensate by changing the amounts of carbon dioxide in your body. So pag metabolic acidosis yan, ibig sabihin konti na lang ang bicarbonate sa katawan. Since carbon dioxide is acidic, it will compensate by decreasing the amount of your carbon dioxide to less than the normal, which is less than 35 millimeter mercury. Pag metabolic alkalosis naman, nasobrahan ng bicarbonate levels, your body will compensate by increasing acid in the body or by increasing carbon dioxide levels in the body. Kaya, ang normal na nakikita natin sa ABG, ang usual na nakikita natin sa ABG is more than 45 millimeter mercury. So, that is what we meant by compensation. Nuna nga to ti respiratory, ti agam compensate ni metabolic. Nuna nga to ti metabolic, ti problema tayo kat metabolic, ti agam compensate dita kat ni carbon dioxide. So, how will we know if, or paano ba natin madidetermine ang compensation? Your compensation would either be uncompensated, partially compensated, and fully compensated. Okay, so what are the three types of compensation? So after you are able to determine whether it is acidosis or alkalosis and whether it is respiratory or metabolic, now we will determine the type of compensation. So the three types are your uncompensated, partially compensated, and your fully compensated. You can also say full compensation, partial compensation, or uncompensated, or no compensation at all. So how will you know if it is uncompensated? It is uncompensated if the pH is abnormal and either of the two dito, your bicarbonate or your PaCO2 is, one is normal and one is abnormal. So it's either yung PaCO2 lang ang abnormal, tapos normal yung bicarbonate, or baliktad. Yung bicarbonate ang abnormal, yung PaCO2 ang normal. So, kung ganyan yung situation yan, you call that your uncompensated or no compensation. Pag partially compensated naman, the situation is that everything is abnormal. pH is abnormal, your bicarbonate is abnormal, and also your PaCO2 is abnormal. So, in this case, pag abnormal lahat, partially compensated, why? Ibig sabihin, your body is trying to change either of the two so that mag-normalize ang pH. So, ongoing pa lang ang compensation dyan. Kaya, partially compensated. Ang uncompensated naman in this case is walang ginawa yung katawan. Kaya, uncompensated. Pag fully compensated, in this case, the pH is already normal. The pH is normal pero abnormal ang HCO3 or yung PaCO2. So, ibig sabihin, nagkaroon na ng compensation. So, yung ginawa ng katawan, tinaas niya or binaba niya yung either of the two para mag-normalize ang pH. Mamabalin ba nga maging normal dyan may sahaan? Kasi, hindi na yun magiging, you will never encounter that situation na yung isa dyan normal din yung pH. Kasi in this case, dapat may compensation. Laging may compensation dyan. Pag may abnormal dyan, it will always affect the pH. Okay, let's start to give you examples so that we will be able to understand that. So, take note, pag uncompensated, pH is abnormal, either or, your PaCO2 or your HCO3 is abnormal. Yung isa, normal. Partially compensated siya if lahat abnormal. Kasi madama nga, i-compensate, ti bagita yung abnormalize ti pH tayo. Fully compensated naman yan if nag-normalize na ang pH natin. But in this case, syempre, dahil nga nag-compensate ang katawan, abnormal yung values natin. So, let's try to give you examples. So, we have here 7.3 na pH, PaCO2 of 50, and 49 na bicarbonate. So, in this case, let's determine first, step 1, sinabi natin is to know whether it is acidosis or alkalosis. 7.35 to 7.45 ang normal dyan. So, it is less than. So, ibig sabihin, that is acidosis. PaCO2 is 50. Normal is, from there, 35 to 45. That is more than 45 since directly related with acidosis. So, this is acidosis. So, most likely, it is the case of your PaCO2 is respiratory. Next, we also have here your bicarbonate is 49. 22 to 26 ang normal natin dyan. So, ibig sabihin, this is alkalosis. So, this is still abnormal inya. So, in this case, since already considered respiratory, ang answer natin dyan is respiratory acidosis. What type of compensation is this? Sa step 3 na natin. Since in this case, abnormal din ang HCO3 natin. So, in this case, abnormal. So, saan dyan? Pag abnormal lahat, that is partial compensation or partially compensated. So, your answer here should be respiratory acidosis, partial compensation. Ma'am, kas anong nga na-determine nga respiratory acidosis? Just take note kung saan nagkapareho yung pH. So, in this case, dalawa silang acidosis. So, most likely, ang problema kasi dyan is respiratory na. Since dito'y alkalosis, hindi naman siya alkalosis. So, hindi siya directly related. Now, let's go to example number 2. So, 7.50, that is also acidosis. Carbon dioxide levels is 51. That is also acidosis. And then we also have here your HCO3 is 41. So 22 to 26. Sorry, this is not acidosis. Mali. Sorry niya. We mentioned 7.50 pala is more than 7.45. So ibig sabihin, that is alkalosis, diba? Alkalosis. In this case, HCO3 is 22 to 26. Since more than 26, that is also alkalosis. Since ti agkapareho, let's go to step 2 now to determine whether it's respiratory or metabolic yung problem. Alkalosis din yan. HCO3 is metabolic. Alkalosis. Now, let's go to step 3, compensation. So, all of them again are abnormal. So, you know that that is partial compensation. Ma'am, what about your uncompensated? Your uncompensated is actually our example here. Since normal ito, abnormal ito, acidosis, so respiratory acidosis, uncompensated. Because one value here is normal, the other is abnormal, and the pH is also abnormal. That is also the same with this one, that is respiratory alkalosis, uncompensated. Now, let's go to your last example for your fully compensated naman. So, in your fully compensated, 7.35 to 7.45, normal na yan, within the range. Carbon dioxide, 35 to 45 ang normal. So, it is more than, that is acidosis. Bicarbonate is 30, 22 to 26 is more than 26 is alkalosis. So, ma'am, how will we now determine whether it should be respiratory or metabolic in nature, or acidosis ba siya or alkalosis? So, the first thing, kung most likely fully compensated ang problema natin here, is to first, there are two ways there are two ways on how we can determine that. Yung pinaka-determinative na way of knowing kung anong type of problem ba yung nasa pasyente natin is to know the diagnosis of the patient. For example, yung diagnosis ng pasyente, COPD. COPD is respiratory in nature. So, nagre-retain ng carbon dioxide ang katawan ng pasyente. So, we will know that nagre-retain ng carbon dioxide. So, that is respiratory acidosis. So, you will know that that is respiratory acidosis na compensate lang kasi in-increase ng katawan yung bicarbonate levels. Or, paano naman kaya pag yung situation ng pasyente natin is that may diarrhea or there is diabetes insipidus. For example, ihi ng ihi, nagulus tayo ng kwan. So, what happens is that, in this case, ang nature na ng problema natin is metabolic because diarrhea related to your metabolic. So, in this case, that is already metabolic alkalosis, fully compensated because the carbon dioxide, metabolic acidosis na ito, kaso since your body increase its level of carbon dioxide in the body, kaya naging acidic yan, nag-normalize na yung pH natin. However, that is the first way of knowing your So that is the first way of how you will be able to know whether you have what type of problem. Paano pag walang nakalagay na diagnosis in your activity or in your situation? So, of course, in that case, if you have no idea at all kung ano yung diagnosis ng pasyente natin, what will we do? We look into the pH of the patient and we will determine whether it is within its alkalotic side or your acidotic side. What do you mean by alkalotic side and your acidotic side? We will determine whether it is in its alkalotic or acidotic side because, in this case, normal yung pH, but then again, if it is, sabi natin, if it is normal, but the amount or the number or the value of pH is more than 7.40, ibig sabihin, kung yung level or amount niya is 7.41 to 7.45, which is the normal range ng ating pH. Kasi in the case of your fully compensated, di ba, normal talagang pH. Kung value ng pH is 7.41 to 7.45, that is in its alkalotic side. If the level of your pH, on the other hand, is also normal within the normal range of your pH, but it is less than 7.40 or yung range niya is 7.35 to 7.39, that is in its acidotic side. So, in this case, let's try to see. The normal level of your pH is 7.35. So, is it in its alkalotic side or acidotic side? It is in its 7.35. In its acidotic side. So, most likely, acidosis din ito. Let's try to see kung saan dito sa dalawa ang acidosis. So, it is your carbon dioxide. Since carbon dioxide, we know that that is respiratory in nature. So, our answer will be respiratory acidosis. Full compensation or fully compensated. Okay. So that is how we're going to determine your ABG analysis. If you have questions, please do not hesitate to inform me again or at least ask me before your activity. Okay. We're done.